neither here nor there. All Saints Day. 2019, Niels Meltzer, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, stated, unless the UK urgently changes course and alleviates his inhumane situation, Mr. Assange's continued exposure to arbitrariness and abuse may soon end up costing his life. That was in November. In May of last year, Meltzer reported that Assange showed all symptoms typical for prolonged exposure to psychological torture, including extreme stress, chronic anxiety, and intense psychological trauma. He had been deliberately exposed for a period of several years to progressively severe forms of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, the cumulative effects of which can only be described as psychological torture. And Meltzer wrote, in 20 years of work with victims of war, violence, and political persecution, I have never seen a group of democratic states, he didn't put democratic in quotes, but I would, ganging up to deliberately isolate, demonize, and abuse a single individual for such a long time and with so little regard for human dignity and the rule of law. The collective persecution of Julian Assange must end here and now. An international group of jurists, including, I'm proud to say, my organization, the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, wrote a letter to Boris Johnson in the UK, you all know who he is, protesting the involvement of the UK in long-term severe psychological ill treatment of Assange under the European Court of Human Rights. European Convention on Human Rights. They cited international human rights experts, healthcare professionals, and the UN Special Rapporteur, Mr. Meltzer, all of whom found that Assange has been subjected to arbitrary confinement and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment amounting to torture, and that torture poses a grave risk of significant physical, psychological, neuropsychological harm with life-changing and potentially fatal consequences for Assange. He has suffered from a number of debilitating and painful medical conditions, including excruciating tooth abscesses and a serious injury to his shoulder, both of which remained untreated for several years. He was denied permission by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to leave the Ecuadorian embassy to receive hospital treatment, despite a request from the Ecuadorian embassy to the British government for such access to be provided on medical grounds. And Meltzer explained that the oppressive conditions of isolation involving at least 22 hours per day in a single occupancy cell can amount to torture. Now, this came after 9 years of arbitrary and illegal detention in the embassy. The harsh and disproportionate conditions under which he was held have caused further grave injury to his health. And an international group of doctors has expressed serious concern for his present and future safety and well-being. He stated that Assange has been deliberately exposed for a period of several years to persistent and progressively severe forms of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. The cumulative effects can only be described as psychological torture, and some of those symptoms are extreme stress, chronic anxiety, and intense psychological trauma. Julian Assange's father, Mr. John Shipton, reported that his son had further been subjected to physical torture by being put in a hot box. And there's an open letter from legal practitioners and academics to the UK Home Secretary and Shadow Home Secretary. I'm not sure what the Shadow Home Secretary does, but he kind of stays in the shadows from Home Secretary. And they remind the UK that they have a duty to protect Assange's right to life under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the European Convention on Human Rights, and also that there is a prohibition of torture, not just under the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, but also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the European Convention on Human Rights.